At some point, you've probably heard that we only use a small percentage of our brains. And people will usually cite one statistic that's staked a claim as common knowledge.
You know how you only use 10% of your brain?
Let's say the average person uses 10% of their brain.
Your inferior species uses only 10% of your brain.
You know how they say we only use 10% of our brains?
Did you know most people use 10% of their brain?
I think we use more than 10.
How much of it do we actually use? 10%, maybe 20.
Einstein used 9% of his brain. Rupert here uses 2%.
7% of our brains aren't used, bruh.
Everybody on Earth uses 3% of their brain.
The average human being only uses 17% of his brain.
You know how they say that we can only access 20% of our brain?
104% of our brain capacity, as opposed to your 36%?
Well, I use 48% of my brain.
I have no idea.
Those are not accurate. At some point, this idea of humans only using a fraction of their brain became a cultural institution and slowly grew into a go-to option for writers in desperate need of a plot device. Percentage myths are so popular that reputable publications still feel the need to continue debunking the small fraction of a brain myth over and over. It's such a popular untruth that the need to correct it even goes across political ideologies. So this begs a few questions. What is the truth? What's our obsession with it? And of course, while the 10% thing's origin isn't 100% known, it's typically traced to 4 publications in the early 1900s. For most of human history, not a lot was known about how the brain worked. But in 1908, a historically very well-regarded psychologist and philosopher named William James made some headway with the book, The Energies of Men. In that book, he wrote that humans are making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources, which made sense for the time. He didn't say exactly how much, and scientists were still really figuring out what the brain's whole deal was. That we don't use it all concept sort of sat in the background for a couple of decades, until we got the publication of the 1929 World Almanac and Book of Facts. The almanac was extremely popular around this time as a sort of yearly textbook for society, filled with new discoveries and vital info about the world. It's still considered a trustworthy source of information today, but that 1929 edition had an advertisement, not an article, an ad, that said, "Scientists and psychologists tell us we use only about 10% of our brain power." No sources were cited, but if you wanted more information, you could send money to an institute that would teach you all about the ways you could gain thousands of dollars, peace of mind, happiness, and independence. That organization no longer exists, but the 10% myth does. Then, starting in the 1930s, a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield started experimenting with using electricity to stimulate different parts of the brain. Through his career, he made some major breakthroughs to understanding how the neurological system worked. But not every area reacted the same, if at all, to his electrical tests or surgical treatments. He called these unresponsive mystery areas the silent cortex. He continued to revolutionize neuroscience through the next 3 decades, but people jumped on the silent cortex as a confirmation of the 10% myth. Then, in 1936, we get the publication of the book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Now, Dale is not responsible for this next part. In the foreword to that book, a famous journalist named Lowell Thomas reprinted the little nugget of misinformation that a standard issue human being develops only 10% of his latent mental ability. But that's just one line in the introduction before the numbers even start in a 291-page book. It's the type of thing an average student skims right past when they're doing a book report. However, when that line is written by one of the most respected voices in journalism, and when that book goes on to sell 30 million copies, making it one of the 50 highest-selling non-religious texts in history, those words do get noticed, and they work their way into general knowledge territory. There's more stuff out there that feeds into the myth, but most of it can ultimately be traced back to these 4 sources. Without equally popular publications to counter it through most of the next century, The general population took the info that was available and mashed it all together as irrefutable fact. Then it started to get really off the rails. As the info went through the grapevine, extra made-up facts and information were thrown in. By far, the most famous example of this is that Albert Einstein bragged about using 15% of his brain instead of everyone else's 10% Purple Monkey dishwasher. That is incorrect. But let's break that down a little bit, and you can see where parts of the small percentage myths start to pick up steam. Albert Einstein, unquestionably and famously a brilliant man. Everyone knows he came up with the equation E equals mc squared, even if they have no idea what it means. The theory of relativity is the type of scientific breakthrough that makes average people believe you when you tell them you're using 15% of your brain while they're only using a measly 10. Einstein was ridiculously smart. So of course he'd know about being smart. That's gotta be true, right? When you look into it though, the Einstein 15% thing has 4 major red flags. First, and most importantly, he never said that. Ever. It's a completely made up quote. Second, while he was a brilliant scientist, Einstein's degrees and expertise were in physics, not neurology. The brain was not his area of study or expertise. Third, how could he have measured the percentage when it was stuck under his own skull and a layer of famously untamable hair? Even if he made the claim, he couldn't have verified it. The first things that gave full-scale readings of a live brain without cutting it open weren't even invented until nearly a decade after his death. Fourth, after Einie died in 1955, his brain was famously removed during his autopsy for research purposes. This was directly against the wishes of him and his family, but the pathologist on call at the hospital where Einstein died took it out to use it for research/money-making purposes. The brain was chopped up into 240 pieces to be measured against other samples. They discovered that Albert had a larger than average parietal lobe, and that specific section was 15% larger than the average humans. People hear the number 15%, which is more than the 10% that had been kicked around, and since Einstein was smarter than the average person, the two statements just naturally merged together. And without any specific data to counter that, it became an undeniable truth for most people. So, if it's not 10% or 15%, the answer is pretty much all of it. The purpose of almost every section in your brain has been accounted for. Scientists now know a biologically healthy noggin is able to use everything issued to it, just not necessarily all at the same time. If we didn't use that much of our brain, evolution would have gotten rid of all the excess by now. This happens to all sorts of physical traits and functions throughout life's various kingdoms. As for the brain, that thing is doing more than just sitting there twiddling your thumbs for you. And different structures in the brain are in charge of different things. You need to breathe and have a heartbeat? That's the medulla. You want to just look at stuff? Signals are sent from your eyes to the occipital lobe. Want to not fall over? Get yourself a good cerebellum. It's been roughly a century since James, Penfield, and Thomas, among others, unintentionally inspired a wave of disinformation. But since then, scientists have been able to better map out the functions and capabilities of all of our various thinky parts. Penfield in particular was right about things running on electricity. He just didn't have the technology to properly measure it all early on in his studies. But he helped inspire a wave of breakthroughs throughout neuroscience. There's a whole lot of body to manage and a whole lot of thoughts to think. We now know that the human brain handles this with 86 billion neurons, making about 10 trillion connections between each other. Stuff happens when electrical signals are passed between these cells. And to conduct all of that electrical energy, 60% of the brain is actually made of fat, making it the tubbiest organ in the human body. None of that was known when the percentage myths started popping up. With all of that said, the brain can't process everything everywhere all at once. You'll need at least one rewatch for that. Too much of that electrical activity at the same time, whether it's throughout the whole brain or concentrated in a certain area, can overload the system and result in a seizure, something that I've got some firsthand experience with. We now have a better understanding of this since imaging technology like MRIs and CAT scans were developed in the second half of the 20th century. Tracking the signals shows that different synapses go to work depending on the situation. Yes, some people can juggle more functions at the same time than others, but nobody's brain is giving them the ability to if they get over 10. So next time someone drops a brain percentage fact, if they got that info from a movie or the grapevine or some amateur social media account, ask to see the receipts, check your sources, and use your brain. All of it.